The neon glow of the bar's sign flickered against the rain-slicked pavement, casting rippling red reflections onto the street. Inside, the low hum of conversation mixed with the clink of glasses and the muted bass of a forgotten 90s pop song. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey, sweat, and something unspoken, an energy John hadn't felt in years. He sat at the counter, fingers loosely wrapped around his second bourbon, letting the slow burn of alcohol dull the restlessness coiling inside him. It had started as a simple night out, a way to shake the monotony of his marriage. Ben, his husband of 6 years, had been working late shifts at the hospital for months. Their conversations reduced to half-hearted goodnights and hurried good mornings. Their bed had grown colder, and John felt like a ghost drifting through their once warm home. He hadn't come here looking for anything, but temptation had a way of finding those who were already lost. Across the bar, a man caught his eye, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the unmistakable Navy uniform of the city police force. He exuded an effortless authority. His face, rugged and sharp, carried the kind of confidence that wasn't practiced. It was earned. The officer's gaze settled on John, piercing and unreadable. It lingered for a second too long. John swallowed hard, heat creeping up his neck. The man smirked, tipping his glass in a silent toast before taking a slow, deliberate sip. There was no mistaking the intent behind his stare. John knew he should look away. He should finish his drink, pay his tab, and go home. Instead, he held the officer's gaze, his pulse hammering in his throat. Minutes passed like that. Two men in a silent conversation, neither had started, neither willing to break it. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, the officer stood and made his way over. Whiskey? His voice was deep, edged with amusement. John lifted his glass. Bourbon. Good choice. The man slid onto the stool beside him, his presence commanding attention without effort. Jake. John. Jake extended a hand. John hesitated before shaking it, the grip firm, warm, lingering a beat too long. You live around here, John? John nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of the way Jake's eyes roamed over him, casual but assessing. He wasn't just making conversation. He was measuring interest, looking for an opening. Married? Jake asked, nodding toward a faint tan line on John's ring finger. John let out a breath, setting his glass down. Yeah. Jake tilted his head, studying him. But here alone. It wasn't a question. John exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face. He wanted to say something clever, something that would deflect the weight of this moment. But instead, he found himself answering with quiet honesty. Yeah, he repeated. Here alone. Jake nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. He signaled the bartender, ordered another round, and when their drinks arrived, he clinked his glass against John's. To being alone together. John smirked despite himself and took a sip. The conversation flowed easily after that. Jake was sharp, confident without arrogance, and carried himself with the kind of controlled dominance that made John's stomach tighten. He talked about his years on the force, the long hours, the stress, things that, in some ways, mirrored Ben's life as a surgeon. But where Ben's exhaustion had created distance, Jake's only seemed to sharpen his hunger. John wasn't naive. He knew exactly what this was. The glances, the way Jake leaned in just slightly when he spoke, the way his knee brushed against John's and didn't move away, was all deliberate. And John was letting it happen. As the night wore on, the bar began to empty, but neither of them moved. The air between them was charged, a slow-building storm ready to break. When the bartender finally called last rounds, Jake leaned in, voice lower now, more intimate. Let me give you a ride. John should say no. He should laugh it off, thank Jake for the drink, and walk away. He should go home to Ben. Instead, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, Jake smiled. He didn't push, didn't insist. He simply stood, pulled a few bills from his wallet, and placed them on the counter. Then, with an easy confidence, he walked toward the door. John watched him go, his pulse thundering. This was it. A moment suspended in time, a choice hovering between regret and desire. Then, without allowing himself time to think, John downed the rest of his bourbon, grabbed his jacket, and followed Jake into the night. The patrol car smelled like leather, cold air, and something faintly metallic. Gunpowder, maybe. The faint hum of the radio played in the background, dispatch voices blending into white noise. John sat in the passenger seat, fingers curled around the edges of his jacket, heart slamming against his ribs. He shouldn't be here. Jake hadn't spoken much since they left the bar. He didn't need to. The weight of what was happening sat thick between them, unspoken but undeniable. When he finally turned onto a quiet side street and pulled into a shadowed alley, John's stomach flipped. The engine cut off. Silence swallowed them whole. Jake turned to face him, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other draped over his thigh. His uniform stretched over his broad chest, the faint glow from the dashboard casting sharp angles across his face. John swallowed hard. "This where you arrest me?" He meant it as a joke, but his voice came out rough, uncertain. Jake smirked. "Depends. You planning on resisting?" The air grew thick, humming with an energy that sent a pulse of heat down John's spine. This was a line, razor-thin and dangerous. One wrong move, and there would be no coming back. John exhaled, leaning back against the seat. He should get out of the car. He should open the door, walk home, and pretend this never happened. But he didn't move. Jake reached out, slow and deliberate, fingers grazing John's knee. A test. John's breath caught. His body tensed, not from fear, but from the sheer force of wanting something he shouldn't. "This is a bad idea," John murmured. Jake didn't pull away. Probably. The next few seconds stretched unbearably. The world outside didn't exist, just the car, the darkness, the heat between them. John closed his eyes, tried to picture Ben, their apartment, the warmth of their bed, the vows they had exchanged years ago. But all he could feel was the weight of Jake's hand, inching higher. Then he was moving, turning toward Jake, leaning in before he could stop himself. Their mouths meant a collision of heat and hunger, a desperate, reckless kiss that shattered whatever restraint John had left. Jake groaned against his lips, fingers digging into John's thigh. The taste of whiskey lingered on his tongue, mixing with something deeper, something forbidden. John gasped as Jake's hand slid to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. Every nerve in his body screamed with need, drowning out the voice in his head telling him to stop. This wasn't gentle. It wasn't slow. It was raw, consuming, a release of everything John had been holding back for too long. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this was wrong, knew he would regret this. But regret was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he let himself fall. John woke to the sound of rain tapping against a bedroom window. The sheets beneath him were soft, familiar, carrying the scent of home, of Ben. For a moment, in the quiet haze between sleep and waking, he almost believed last night had been a dream. Then his phone buzzed on the nightstand. His pulse lurched. He didn't have to look to know who it was. Jake. John's throat went dry. His muscles tensed as fragments of the night before came rushing back. The heat of Jake's mouth on his, the weight of his hands gripping firm, the way every touch had unraveled him so effortlessly. And the worst part? He had let it. He had wanted it. A warm stir beside him, and John turned, heart clenching at the sight of Ben curled under blankets, his chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. His dark curls were tousled, his face softened by sleep, the faintest hint of a smile at the corners of his lips. He looked peaceful, oblivious. Guilt slammed into John's ribs like a punch. He forced himself to move, slipping out of bed with careful precision. His legs were sore, his body still humming from Jake's touch. The realization sent another wave of nausea rolling through him. In the bathroom, he gripped the sink and stared at his reflection. His skin was flushed, lips slightly swollen. There, a faint mark near his collarbone. He yanked his shirt up over it, as if that could erase what had happened. Another buzz. This time, John grabbed the phone. His hand shook as he unlocked it. "Jake, couldn't get you out of my head." Round two? John's stomach twisted. A part of him had expected, no, hoped, that Jake wouldn't reach out, that this was a momentary lapse, a mistake left to dissolve in the silence. But Jake wasn't the type to disappear. And worse, a sick thrill curled in John's gut to text. God, what was wrong with him? He typed quickly, hands unsteady. "John, We can't. Last night was a mistake. 3 dots appeared. A pause. Then, Jake. Didn't feel like one to me. John exhaled sharply, shutting his eyes. He could still feel Jake's breath against his skin, the rough scrape of his stubble against his jaw, the way his name had sounded low and wrecked between them. No. He had to bury this. He deleted the thread, shoving the phone into his pocket, like it was something dangerous. Out of sight, out of mind. A knock sounded at the bathroom door. John. Ben's voice was thick with sleep. You okay? John inhaled sharply, plastering on a mask before cracking the door open. Yeah, just woke up early. Ben yawned, rubbing a hand over his face. Come back to bed for a bit? John hesitated. His first instinct was to pull away, but he caught himself. If he changed now, if he started acting different, Ben would know, and John could not let that happen. So he forced a smile, stepping closer, pressing a kiss to Ben's forehead. Yeah, he whispered. Of course. Ben wrapped an arm around him, pulling him back toward the warmth of their bed. John let himself sink into it, let Ben's arms surround him. But the guilt didn't fade, and somewhere deep in his chest, a terrifying thought took root. John knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the apartment. The air inside was too still, too charged, like the moment before a storm. Ben stood in the kitchen, his back to the door, shoulders stiff. His phone rested on the counter, screen glowing. John set his keys down carefully. Hey, he said, keeping his voice light. Didn't think you'd be home yet. Ben turned slowly. His face was unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides. And then John saw it. Ben's phone wasn't just glowing. It was open to John's messages, to Jake's name. A sharp bolt of panic shot through him. He deleted those texts. He was sure of it, but maybe he hadn't been careful enough. Maybe Ben had seen the notification before he could erase it. Ben. How long? Ben's voice was eerily calm, controlled, but beneath it, John could hear the cracks forming. John swallowed hard. Ben, it's not. How? Long. John's mouth went dry. He could lie. He could spin something, twist it into a misunderstanding. But one look at Ben, the tightness in his jaw, the glassiness in his eyes, and he knew there was no getting out of this. John exhaled shakily, dropping his gaze. It was just once. A bitter laugh escaped Ben. He shook his head, pressing his fingers to his temples like he was trying to hold himself together. God, John, do not insult me. John flinched. He had never heard Ben sound like this. Ben took a slow step forward, eyes burning into him. I work 60-hour weeks. I come home exhausted. And all this time, I've been thinking, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm not giving him enough. His voice cracked. But you just went and fucked someone else. John's stomach twisted. It wasn't like that. Ben let out a harsh breath, rubbing his hands over his face. Then tell me what it was like. John opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come, because how could he explain it? How could he explain the ache, the loneliness, the way Jake had made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in so long? How could he say it hadn't been about sex, that it had been about something deeper, something darker, something he hadn't even realized he needed? Ben scoffed at his silence. Yeah, that's what I thought. John stepped forward instinctively, reaching for him. Ben, please. But Ben jerked away like he had been burned. Don't, he choked out. John's chest squeezed. I love you. It sounded weak, desperate. Ben's laugh was hollow. No, you don't. He looked at John then, really looked at him, and something shattered between them. Because if you did, this never would have happened. John felt his breath hitch, his world tilting. Ben grabbed his keys from the counter. I can't do this right now. John panicked. Where are you going? Ben didn't answer. He walked past John without another word, and before John could stop him, the door slammed shut. Silence filled the apartment, heavy and deafening. John stood there, his whole body trembling, his throat tight. He had told himself, over and over, that he could keep the secret, that he could bury it, move on, pretend nothing had happened. But lies had a way of unraveling. And now, he had lost the only thing that had ever really mattered.